You know, it was about, I guess, 4.5 years ago now when I first learned that I was going to be moving from Chicago, where I had been living for the last 6 years, to a small town in rural Kansas. And as a Mennonite, I was really looking forward to moving from a city where no one even knew what a Mennonite was to a state like Kansas that has such a rich Mennonite heritage. And I think in hindsight, I may have talked about it a little too much, to the point where a friend of mine finally just asked me, she said, "Eric, are you a Christian or are you a Mennonite?" Now, I know she kind of meant that tongue-in-cheek. I understand she was trying to make a point, but it was one of those questions that kind of stuck in my mind, you know. And I thought about it, and I realized that ultimately I actually do identify first and foremost with my Mennonite faith. Now, why is that? Well, for me, being a Mennonite is very cultural. You know, we have Mennonite names, we have Mennonite camps, Mennonite colleges, Mennonite food. The history of our denomination is a history of struggle, a history of persecution. It's not easy. You really kind of have to want it, I think. And for me, I don't want my faith to be easy, because I think when things are easy, we have a tendency to take them for granted. Now, as an example, I had a friend of mine back in Chicago, and every Sunday morning he would get up early. He would make sure that his wife and their 3 daughters were up and dressed and ready to go. And they'd arrive at church early and sit right in the front pew, where I noticed no one is this morning. That's okay. They'd sit right in the front pew dressed in their Sunday best. And as soon as the service began, he would reach into his bag and he would pull out the latest New York Times bestseller. And he would spend the next hour reading, completely oblivious to whatever might have been happening during the service. And I asked him one time why that was. I said, "Brad, you know, your daughters, they kind of resent this, forcing them to get up early and get dressed, and then you don't even pay attention. Why is that?" His response to me essentially was that he believed as long as his family was up and dressed and ready to go and in church, they were demonstrating their Christianness, for lack of a better term. He was demonstrating his role as the head of a Christian household. And I said, "You know, Brad, I can go sit in my garage. It doesn't make me a car. Sitting in a pew doesn't make you Christian either." But that was his belief, and I am not here to pass judgment. I think realistically, we probably all know people like that. You know, they might be Presbyterian, they might be Methodist, they might even gasp, be Mennonite. But demonstrating our faith on a day-to-day basis outside of the hour or two that we spend in church on a Sunday morning, it's not easy. It's something I think we all struggle with. It requires some discipline. But it shouldn't be easy, because I think if it were easy, we would take it for granted. The question then becomes, if our call is to demonstrate our faith every day, every moment of our lives, then how do we do that? And the answer to that question for me is that I try to demonstrate my faith through stewardship. Because stewardship isn't just something that we can do every day. Stewardship is something that all of God's disciples are called to. Now, being a steward is actually a title, or was a title when the word first appeared. It was a position given to a highly trusted servant on the estates of noble landowners back in medieval Europe. And among other duties, the steward's job was to keep track of who was farming the noble's land, what they were growing, how the crops were doing, and making sure that the taxes and duties owed to the landowner were being collected. Now, these taxes were the landowner's sole source of income, so entrusting them to a steward was a position, obviously, of great trust. Even though the steward didn't actually own any land himself, he was entrusted with his master's entire estate. And my hope is that that job description sounds very familiar, because as stewards of God's creation, that's exactly what we are called to every single day as well. As much as we like to think it, no one in this room owns our houses. None of us own our cars. No one owns the time in our day. No one owns the money in our bank accounts. We've been entrusted to care for those things by our master who actually owns them. And we're entrusted with those duties only as long as we inhabit these earthly bodies. And I know that that's a disconcerting thought. I know we like to think we own the things we're going to go home and head back to today, but we have to remember that this idea of ownership is a man-made construct, and it's a construct that only exists as long as the rest of society is willing to play along. It's something we created in an effort to control our environment, as mankind is apt to try to do. But if we set the legal convention aside, it becomes very clear, I think, that everything we have, everything we are, truly belongs to God, and we simply care for it as His stewards. It's been given to us with the understanding that we will take who we are, we'll take what we have, we'll take the gifts and the talents and the abilities that we've been entrusted with, and we will take them out and put them into the world, and we will use them to steward to those with whom we share God's creation, to be good disciples of His Word. Now, there are different ways to think about stewardship, and in my job description as a charitable services representative, I've heard a good number of them. I thought I'd share a couple of them with you today. One of them was a coworker out in Pennsylvania who once described stewardship as a chocolate fountain. Now, we've all probably seen the chocolate fountains, right? The liquid chocolate is pumped up to the top, flows over the sides, fills up the cup, flows over the sides again, and that's where you put your strawberry or your marshmallow or what have you. Or if you're a kid, that's where you stick your mouth and, I don't recommend that, by the way. But, his point in that analogy was that there's no harm in giving away the excess, which is, the stuff that flows over the sides, as long as our cup is full. Now, I see his point, and I kind of like it, but I don't really subscribe to it, and I'll tell you the reason why. Anyone here think that you've got too much time on your hands? You can just sleep in until noon and get up and have a nice leisurely lunch and spend the afternoon just laying on your couch watching TV, go to bed, do it all over again. Doesn't matter how you spend your time, because there's always going to be another day, always another month, always another year. You can do with your time whatever you want. Anyone here have too much money on your hands? You get home and you can't hardly walk in your house because there's just money stacked floor to ceiling. You can't cook because all your pots and pans have money overflowing the sides. You're driving down the road just tossing $100 bills out the windows because you can't get rid of them fast enough. By the way, if I just described you, please come see me after the service. We need to talk. But no one has that problem, quote unquote. And so my issue with his analogy is that as long as we don't believe we have enough of something, as long as we don't believe we have enough time, as long as we don't believe we have enough money, then his analogy has given us an excuse to not give away the excess because we don't believe there is any excess. There's my problem with his analogy. Now, taking another angle, I know that often people view stewardship as kind of a zero-sum game. We only have so many hours in the day, and so if we volunteer for an hour at a homeless shelter, or if we volunteer to serve on the church council, then that's one less hour we have to spend with our families. Or if I have $20 and Karen has nothing, I give her 10 of my dollars, and I've stewarded to Karen, but I've lost half my wealth. And I don't subscribe to that theory, and the reason I don't is that in the Bible, stories abound of situation after situation where our gifts were put out into the world and they were used and they were multiplied and they were returned to us many times over. Think about the story of the loaves and the fishes, right? Think about the farmer who scattered the seeds, and the seeds that landed in good soil and were watered and weren't crowded out by weeds or rocks grew and multiplied 100-fold. For the kids in your lives, think about the Magic Penny song, right? Love is something, if you give it away, you'll end up having more. So stewardship is not a zero-sum game. Now, that said, there are logistical realities. I understand that. I love the story of the widow's mite in Mark 12, but I'm guessing that neither Brad and certainly not myself expect any of you to go to the bank tomorrow and drain your savings account and bring it here to church next Sunday. But here's what strikes me about that verse. Jesus was not encouraging us to be that person. He was not encouraging us to be the widow who was giving away everything. He didn't want us or expect us to be the person in the Bible or in that temple who brings our bags full of money, whether it's 2 coins or everything we own, or both. In keeping with the admonitions in Matthew chapter 6, I think the story reminds us that when we give, and I'm quoting here, when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets, to be honored by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. That's true discipleship. That's stewardship. Because it's not done to glorify yourselves. True giving is done to glorify others. And I can tell you right now that when people come to see me to talk about their desire to use their gifts to steward to others, most of the time, 99.9% of the time, they're not talking about giving to build a new building at Bethel College or Heston College. They don't want a new wing of the hospital named after them, to build a library or a school that is blazoned with their family names. They're not doing it to glorify themselves. They're doing it because they truly want to be disciples of God's word. They want to be good stewards of future generations who will use whatever gift they're giving. These people are talking about the true needs of people they care about. And this might be their children, although often people in their 70s or 80s have figured out that by now their kids are either in retirement or close to retirement, and so are not really counting on a big inheritance. They've already made their retirement plans usually. So they're also usually not wanting it to go to taxes. Now, yes, I understand the federal government needs your tax dollars to build schools and improve roads and that kind of thing, but I can assure you that I have neither the expertise nor the lack of a moral foundation to completely obfuscate the United States tax code, so the federal government will get their money. But if the kids don't need it, and if you don't want your estate to go to taxes, then the third and the final way that you can act as a good disciple to use your gifts to steward to the community is through giving, through charitable giving. Those of us who come from development, as I do, call that legacy giving. And certainly creating a legacy is a wonderful thing. But I think it's important we not confuse the creation of a financial legacy with stewardship, because stewardship is much more than just writing a check at the end of your life. Our legacy is being built every single day by the way we live our lives, by the ways in which we display our stewardship. We build our legacy with the organizations we support. We build our legacy with the time we volunteer. We build our legacy with every moment of every day where people just see us living our lives. We build our legacy with the families we leave behind, our children, our grandchildren. Every moment that your grandkids or your kids see you living your life in accordance with God's word is another moment, another brick in the monument that you will someday leave behind as your true legacy. It's an opportunity to show them that you truly understand our call to use our God-given gifts to care for others. That's your legacy. Now, when I think about using our God-given talents, there's a story that always comes to mind. I was giving my very first sermon back at my home church in Illinois, and their tradition was, and maybe it is here as well, that after the service, the pastor would go to the back of the sanctuary, and as people finished shaking hands and fellowshipping for a few minutes, they would file past and shake hands, and how are the kids, how's the garden, nice weather we're having, whatever they would say. And so I did that as well. And I went to the back, and people were filing past, and at one point a young couple came through with 2 boys, probably about 5 and 7 years old. And I noticed that when the rest of his family continued down the stairs into the fellowship hall, the younger of the 2 boys stayed up by me, and he waited until the rest of the congregation had filed past, and he got back in line a second time. And he came up to me and he put up his little hand to shake mine. And so I went to shake his. And I felt something in my palm, and I looked, and he was trying to pass me a dollar bill. I got down on one knee, and I put my hand on his shoulder. I said, "Oh, son," I said, "No, that's so sweet, but I don't want to take your money." And he looked at me, and I saw tears well up in his eyes. "Oh, no, sir," he said, "please take it. I heard my daddy say you were the poorest preacher we ever had." Now, as bruising as that moment was to my ego, I find myself thinking about that little boy a lot, because in a way that he could not have understood, in a way that he could not possibly have articulated, that little boy was doing exactly what we are called to do every single day. He was believing that that dollar bill in my hands would do me more good than it was doing for him just sitting in his piggy bank. And I think that I think the best example of that story in the Bible is the parable of the talents that was just read for us. And we all know the story, of course, the master who entrusted his servants with talents. Talent, by the way, in that context, was actually a measure of volume. Biblical historians will tell us that a talent was equal to anywhere between 75 and 110 pounds of gold. So even one talent was not an insignificant sum. But one servant was given five of those. Another was given 2, and another was given 1. And the first 2 servants took their talents of gold, and they went out into the world, and they invested them and traded for them, whatever it was they did, and doubled their master's money. And of course, the master returned home and saw the wonderful things they had done and rewarded them richly. But the servant to whom only 1 talent of gold was given was afraid. Afraid perhaps that he would lose it, afraid that it would be used incorrectly, who knows, but was afraid to the point where he chose instead to bury it under a rock in the ground. And when his master returned home, and the servant returned that talent to him, still shiny and new and unused, and his master saw the sinful waste of talent, the servant was admonished, "You wicked slave." Now, whatever your particular ideas may be about the gifts and the talents and the abilities that God has given to you and how you might use them to glorify His kingdom, bear in mind that every single one of us is someday going to find ourselves in that situation. We are all going to stand in front of our Master, and He is going to ask us how we used our talents. He's going to ask us what we did with our time, with our money, with our abilities. He's going to ask us how we served the poor and the sick and the naked and the hungry and the imprisoned, all those people whom Jesus called the least of these. He's going to ask us how we cared for all those people to whom God may have given less, but who are no less deserving. And I don't know about you, but I, for one, do not want to stand in front of my master and hand him back my talent, still shiny and new, and hear him say to me, "You wicked slave." I was speaking with a man several months ago, and I shared with him that my favorite part of working for Everence was doing exactly what I'm doing right now. Talking with people about their gifts, about their talents, and how they can use those gifts to care for the world around them. By comparison, he shared with me that he really didn't believe he had any gifts that could be shared. And yet, over the course of our conversation, I learned that he and his wife lead the first through fifth grade Sunday school class at their church every Sunday. I've tried to wrangle children in church. I'm guessing a number of you in this building right now have tried to do the same. And so I think we can all speak from experience when we say that his gifts of caring, his gifts of patience, his gifts of engagement, for that younger generation, those things are all tremendous gifts. But he'd never seen it. Similarly, when I was young, my grandmother thought I had a beautiful singing voice. I think probably all grandmothers think that about their grandkids, right? I didn't see it. I didn't believe her. I never did anything with it. But when I moved to Kansas, a good friend of mine invited me to join the Kansas Mennonite Men's Chorus with him. Of course, they stuck me way up in the back row. But I figured, with 300 other people to drown me out, yeah, okay. But I go to our concerts and I look out at the audience when we're singing, and I can see and I can feel the Spirit of God moving in their midst. And now I understand why God gave that gift to me. But we all have those things, right? We have those things that they just come easy. They're just things we do. We like kids, so we teach a Sunday school class. We like to sing, so we sing. No big deal. That person has a gift. She's got a fantastic gift. She can do amazing things with that. If only I had that gift. We can always see it in the other person, right? But we can't see it ourselves because to us, it's just there. It's just simple. It's just easy. And because it's easy, we take it for granted. Whatever your particular gifts may be, there is nothing that we have. There is nothing that we are that wasn't given to us so that we could use it to care for God's creation, including the people with whom we share that creation. We just have to have faith. And I think in asking us to share our gifts, that's essentially what God is asking of us, right? To have faith. Faith that our gifts will be used the way God wanted them to be used, or the way that we can use them. Faith that we'll still have enough, that our cup will still be full. Faith that what we're sharing is a gift that's worthy of being shared. And Matthew 13 mentions this kind of faith. Starting at verse 44, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought the field. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant looking for fine pearls. When he found one of great value, he went away and sold everything he had and bought it. Now, what I find interesting is that just a few chapters later in Matthew 19, we hear a similar type of story from the other side of the equation. In Matthew 19, a rich man approached Jesus and asked, "Teacher, how do I achieve eternal life?" And in verse 21, Jesus answered, "If you want to be perfect, go, sell your possessions, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." So in this example, a rich man who claimed to have been a disciple of God all of his life hung his head and walked away. He couldn't do it. He couldn't do exactly what the other two men had done. He couldn't sell all that he had and give to the poor in order to secure his treasure in heaven. Why is that? For me, I think the difference is that in Matthew 13, the two men had found treasure. They could see it. They could touch it. It was tangible. But what's the definition of faith that we're given in the Bible? Faith is a belief in things not seen. So the rich man should have known that he too had found treasure. And all he had to do to secure that treasure was to sell all that he had. But he couldn't do it. He didn't have that same level of faith. He couldn't make the same commitment that the other two men had done because he couldn't see God's kingdom. He couldn't feel it. He couldn't touch it. It wasn't tangible. His faith only lay in those earthly treasures with which he had filled his house. All of us in this room are disciples of Christ. If we weren't, we wouldn't be sitting here today. And hopefully that's the reason that we choose to live our lives every day in accordance with the gospel that the Lord has given to us. As disciples, we are called to that deeper level of faith. You know, the 12 apostles who followed Jesus were told to give up everything they had to follow him. It was a symbolic gesture, I believe, to those of us who sit here today. And it serves to remind us that our gifts were given to us for a reason. We don't have to give up everything we have, but we do have to recognize that the things we have are not owned by us and that they were given to us for a reason. The gifts and the talents that we have, that the God has given to us and entrusted with us, equip us to move beyond this daily world of paying bills and going to work and making supper and driving kids to soccer practice. We can use our gifts to achieve a world where God's creatures live for one another and not just for ourselves. And that, I think, is our challenge today. Our challenge is to never be complacent. The gifts that every single one of us possess are as unique to you as your fingerprints. There is no one in this world of 6+ billion people who has the gifts and the ability to do with those gifts what you can do, or what you can do, or what you can do. Find those gifts. Use those gifts as God intended, and we will watch God's kingdom grow.